Our next chapter is to have a panel of distinguished individuals discussing issues presented by the Age of Jacksonian Democracy. If I could ask the members of the panel to come up to the stage. The panel moderator is Alan Taylor, who is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He taught previously at the University of California, Davis, and Boston University. Taylor has authored 7 books, including The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, which was a National Book Award for nonfiction finalist in 2013 and won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in History. His book, William Cooper's Town, I always thought of Cooperstown as the home for the Hall of Fame. William Cooper's Town, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of the Early American Republic, won the 1996 Bancroft, Beveridge, and Pulitzer Prizes. Taylor is a graduate of Colby College and received his PhD from Brandeis University.
Thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. I also want to thank Jamie for all of his hard work in organizing this for today. Although we're focusing on Andrew Jackson, I have a contractual obligation to introduce Thomas Jefferson into the conversation. So I'm going to smuggle him in when I have an opportunity. I suppose you've all heard it said that our politics now have never been so polarized. And this always amuses historians. And having just heard the Heidler's very vivid presentation of the politics of the 1820s and 1830s, I think we can agree that our politics have been plenty polarized in the past. One of the topics that I've looked at as a historian is the War of 1812 and its legacies. And one of those legacies, which we have usually focused in on, is nationalism. That the Battle of New Orleans, for example, is a great focus for Americans to feel good about themselves. And it's a focus they very much needed because the rest of the War of 1812 had gone so badly. And it certainly is true that there is a great effusion of national symbol making and celebration and the singing of the song that would later become the national anthem and other patriotic anthems. It is a period in which you can feel this sense of relief in the country, that the country had survived a very severe test in the War of 1812 that had nearly blown it apart. Now, the War of 1812 now looms pretty small in our historical imagination. It's eclipsed on one side by the Revolution before, or by the Civil War that came later. But for people of Andrew Jackson's generation, the War of 1812 was of enormous importance. And I would say it generates powerful contradictions. That in addition to the nationalism promoted by the War of 1812, it also generated new tensions between the regions. New England had come very close to seceding from the Union in alienation from this war. And to justify its alienation from the war and the Madison administration, it had put out into the press, into statements in Congress, a very negative portrayal of Southern society. It had emphasized slavery in public discourse as never before, as a moral basis for justifying New England's superiority and the inferiority, moral inferiority of the South. It is hard to exaggerate the anger that this generated in much of the South, but particularly in Virginia, which previously had been relatively strong national supporter of the government, of a national vision, so long as Virginians were governing the country. And the great bone of contention would be the West. And the West at that time began with the Appalachian Mountains. It's important to recall that the nation took shape through westward expansion. As of 1790, there were no states west of the Appalachian Mountains, and less than 5% of the citizens of the United States lived there. By 1860, most Americans would live west of the Appalachians, and most of the states in the Union were states that had not existed in 1790 and lay west of the mountains. On the one hand, this western expansion could build the nation, could build a greater sense of national cohesion, but it also bred powerful tensions between the sections, manifest particularly in Congress, as regional politicians feared losing a balance of power between the regions. And this issue would be highlighted when an obscure New York congressman, James Talmadge, in 1819, did something unprecedented. He ignored his party leaders and introduced an amendment to Missouri's admission to the Union to require Missouri to commit to a gradual emancipation of slavery. Now, never before had Congress sought to restrict slavery in a new state. But Talmadge was acting on the proposition, a proposition that would become more powerful in the northern and midwestern states thereafter, that the success of the American Republic would hinge upon that republic becoming, at least in a majority of its states, committed to free citizens and in the possession of free citizens. Now, this did not represent any sort of racial enlightenment, because the proponents of this were committed to a free soil doctrine in which they also hoped that African Americans could be deported from the country and sent to Africa. But it is powerfully at odds with the ambitions of Southern politicians and Southern voters, which is that they should be able to freely expand to the westward and take their property. And indeed, they believed that if they could not do these things, that it would lead to a social explosion within their states as black populations grew and would ultimately revolt. And so now I can introduce Thomas Jefferson, who had the famous statement that after he heard the debates over Missouri, there was, quote, like a fire bell in the night, wakened and filled me with terror, end quote. Now, this is telling because a fire bell in Virginia was also understood to be the symbol of a slave revolt breaking out. Virginians very powerfully believed that they had a surplus of slaves, but they did not wish to free those slaves. They wished to sell them. And they wished to sell them to places further south and west, which were thriving because of the cotton boom. One of the great consequences of the War of 1812, which the Heidlers mentioned, is the success of American arms not against the British, but against native peoples in conquering places we now call Alabama or Michigan or Indiana and Wisconsin, and opening up vast new territories for a great acceleration of American expansion. But this also led to a great conflict between the doctrines of diffusion, that the future of American slavery should be that of diffusing it over the continent, and that of restriction, the suggestion that slavery needed to be restricted within one region so that eventually it could die in the whole country. Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing the other panelists. You have detailed biographies of their accomplishments in your materials, so I'm just going to provide the briefest of introductions to them. And they will each have about 5 minutes to make some comments about their own teaching and their own scholarship in this field. And then I have a set of questions that I will explore with them, with their help, and then we'll open the floor up for your questions. Carolyn Barrows is to my right, and she is a high school United States history teacher at the Edward M. Kennedy Academy for Health Careers in the Boston Public Schools, where she has taught for the past 7 years. To my left, Laura Honeywood is a 10th and 12th grade history and political philosophy teacher at the Academy of the Pacific Rim Public Charter School in Boston. R. Kent Neumeyer, further to my left, is a professor of the University of Connecticut School of Law, specializing in the political, constitutional, and legal history of the early national period. And to the far right, my far right, your far left, Theda Perdue is the Atlanta Distinguished Professor Emeriti at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So we will begin and go in the order, alphabetical order. And so, Carolyn, you're up.
Good morning. I would like to extend my great appreciation to the Pioneer Institute and to Jamie Gass for hosting such a valuable event and for including me as part of it. I must say that it is a tremendous honor and quite intimidating to sit amongst such a prestigious group of scholars dedicated to extending our understanding of the past and working toward history's continued value in the education of our youth today. As said, my name is Carrie Barrows, and I am a 9th grade U.S. History 1 teacher at the Edward M. Kennedy Academy for Health Careers. I am extremely fortunate to be working in a school that places a high priority on history education, with a team of highly qualified and intensely motivated colleagues. At our school, students are required to complete the state-regulated 3 years of history before moving on to a 4th year of either civics, social justice, or AP history. I highlight this because it is not the norm for most Boston public schools, but it should be. When asked to be on this panel, I gave a lot of thought to what I might be able to contribute to this conversation. And one of the things I am able to offer is insight into the challenges of teaching a unit as complex and messy as the Age of Jackson to students who remain rooted in their concrete thinking skills. As I'm sure you can imagine, it is very hard for students to put themselves in the place of news and messages traveling only as fast as a horse's gallop. In doing this, I would also like to be able to emphasize the tremendous opportunity we have to make connections with students in order to create relevancy to their lives and explore examples of how they might become more active citizens in their world. Teaching history requires helping students understand the historical narrative that has created the country we live in today. This requires us as teachers to recognize and respect the multitude of voices that contribute to our present-day society. Additionally, as history teachers, we have the responsibility to develop the essential critical thinking skills and academic skills that are so very important as our students become members of this active citizenry. Within the 9th grade U.S. History 1 curriculum, we have the opportunity to discuss changing identities, values, and beliefs, creating new communities, and affecting change within society. As a class, we get to use the stories of the past to help us not only understand our present world today, but also our present-day personal experiences. It is in this connection between past and present that history becomes relevant and alive for our students. In my opinion, there is no other topic in U.S. History 1 that gives us such a great opportunity for connection than does Jacksonian democracy, westward expansion, and reform. During this particular time period, there is a recreation of the national identity. Society is changing rapidly with technology, geographic boundaries, political boundaries, and social norms. As people move west and cultures collide, students are challenged to assess the cost-benefit of expansion. Studying groups of people finding their voices and speaking up on behalf of themselves and others with the intent to improve the world they live in offers my students a wonderful opportunity for them to dig deep into what people were saying and what it meant for them to say it. Students also have the opportunity to explore how the laws of the country are used or abused by people with political access, and how political access changes over time. For me, the greatest takeaways for my students are understanding that 1, identity is not stagnant, even for countries. 2, injustices within society can be addressed and possibly overcome, especially when people work together and persevere. 3, as part of the citizenry, we must be able to critically analyze and evaluate society's status quo and determine for ourselves what we are willing to accept and what we must work to improve. And finally, 4, we must recognize the need to vote and be active in determining who is representing us and whether that person truly reflects our core values. Teaching Andrew Jackson can be as simple as teaching the chronology and content as required by the state, or as exciting as diving into the muck by immersing ourselves in the rich literature of the times through document analysis, engaging activities, and whole class discussions. I am thrilled to be here today and to discuss how we might best be able to do this. Thank you.
Do you want to sit there, or do you want to speak here? There is fine. Okay, please, it's up to you.
No, it's fine.
Which do you prefer?
I just said that.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, so this is working, do I have to push something? Hi, so I'm Laura Honeywood, and I teach 10th and 12th grade history. I agree with much of what, all of what Carrie said, and my approach to teaching history is sort of through conceptual frameworks. So I'm most interested in getting students to ask interesting questions, and I'm interested in history, especially early US history, as a sort of political experiment where we engage with the new science of politics. And this era, I think, from 1800 to 1848 is how I teach it, really gives us a chance to do that, where people are sort of figuring out, Americans are figuring out how we want our government to work and what works and what doesn't work. So I start my units with questions that they don't have the answers to and maybe haven't had the chance to think through yet, like should states have more power, should the national government have more power? And I put it in the frame of contemporary issues. So I say, on immigration, should states have more power or should the national government have more power? Who should make immigration policies? And they argue about it. They take a stand on different sides of the classroom and talk about what would happen if Arizona could make, why Arizona would want to make their own immigration policy, and what would happen if every state were able to. And then we talk about what were the other ones? Oh, healthcare, or a classroom. So do you want, in a classroom, would you rather have more autonomy or would you rather have the teacher have more control? And what are the positives and negatives of each of those? And I think that the events of this, and then we dive into the actual content and look at what happened. So what happens if the national government makes a law that you don't agree with and you just disobey it? So what happens if Georgia doesn't want to obey the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester versus Georgia? And what happens if the president doesn't force them to? What happens if a nullification crisis happens, if each state can decide whether or not they want to obey national laws? Why would they want to do that? And so they got into these arguments about it, and we sort of traced it. And then we looked at, so then we did a moot court of Arizona versus the United States. And what was great about that is after having all those conversations and being able to argue both sides of it and being able to see both sides of it, then later when I get to a new unit and ask them about the fugitive slave law, even though they disagree with the Fugitive Slave Act and think that Massachusetts should be able to not return fugitive slaves, they're able to hearken back to the nullification crisis and say, oh wait, no, hold on. that might be bad, because then other people might disobey the rule of law. And they're able to bring in Arizona versus US and say, oh, wait, hold on. Then if Arizona's making their own immigration laws, then everybody is gonna, then it's not gonna. So we had these great rich conversations based in history, and they were using real historical examples to support their opinions, which is really what I want them to be able to do. And it's not just something that they've memorized for a test, it's truly using history as a weapon to back up their ideas, which is, sort of the point for me. And also it's great on, so I in theory, I'm preparing them to take the AP US History exam. Not that I teach an AP class, but I just think everybody should have access to the AP US History exam. So then they're able to use that in the synthesis part, if you're an AP US teacher, that they can use Arizona v. US in that last paragraph to say, oh, this is how federalism and these arguments are sort of relevant to today. The other two questions that I think, for me, are really interesting about this era is this question, and this is a question of one of my colleagues that I haven't really, perfected the way that I ask the question yet, but how the freedom of some people is tied to the unfreedom of other people. So how this universal white manhood suffrage is really linked to disempowering and stripping suffrage from other groups. So if suffrage was previously based on property, and so the way that we say that women don't have the right is because we say, oh, laws of coverture, women don't own property, so they don't have the right to vote, and black people already are limited from property through these other, slaves clearly can't vote because they're not free because they don't own property. Well, if we take away property restrictions, well, we still don't want women to vote, so what do we do? And how it might be tied to an increase in racism and sexism. So if we're taking away, and additionally, that these ideas of expanded freedom and these ideas of opportunity are linked to stealing labor and land from Native Americans, American Indians, and African Americans, that through giving everyone this opportunity and this manifest destiny, that it's not just coincidental that this expansion of liberty just happens to coincide with real repression and things like the Cornerstone speech, which say that this is a real danger, that the idea of equality that's in the Declaration of Independence is a real danger to our nation. I think that that's an interesting question. And lastly, I think it's an interesting question, what do you do when the government isn't doing what you want? So if you think that the national government or your state government or local government is getting in the way of your natural rights, what do you do? What's a valid response to that? Do you secede? Do you nullify? Do you just engage in civic disobedience? And how does that conflict with the rule of law? And how does it lessen the rule of law? Which we were talking this morning about the North Carolina laws and how it sets a precedent. Anyway, these are interesting questions to me. Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Kent, do you want the podium, or do you want to speak from there? Okay.
Laura, I would certainly like to take that course. Look, I teach a course at the law school, University of Connecticut School of Law, and it's called American Law and American Slavery. So I guess I'm going to make a pitch today for the fact that you folks out might want to consider a course on slavery when you're teaching your high school courses. And I have a couple of observations about how difficult it is to teach that course. One of the things that I've done that might be useful to you is to maybe start simply with the Constitution of the United States of America and just look at those sections in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 9. The one that intrigues me, and Laura actually mentioned this, is Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, which requires free states to return escaped fugitives without any semblance of due process. No right to counsel, no jury trial, no way of establishing whether the people being returned to slavery are in fact slaves. I mean, it was the most draconian of all of the provisions, it seems to me, in the Constitution. And it's the one, except maybe for the territorial clause, that brought the whole system down. I'm engaged, I think I mentioned to Professor Taylor, a study of the rendition cases actually in the 1850s when escaped slaves go into Massachusetts. There were a group of lawyers who rose almost spontaneously to resist rendition. And so it's a question of, I mean, the question that I perceive at issue here is, what do you do in the face of a law which is obviously immoral? How do you resist it? And as I present the issue to my lawyer-to-be friends at UConn Law School, it's not as easy an issue as it seems, because the other side, who were in favor of rendition, very famous people, Joseph Story, Supreme Court Justice Story, you know, founder of Harvard Law School, the great legal scholar, Lemuel Shaw, who was the greatest state judge probably in American history, certainly in the 19th century, Daniel Webster, all of these big shots were on board with the obligation to return fugitive slaves. And they all, you know, pounded their chests and say how terrible a thing it is to do. We got to do it because it's part of a compromise that made the Union. And the Union, the argument was, is sacred. And so what you got here, it seems to me, is a conflict between two different concepts of morality. One concept was that law and order is itself moral, because the opposite of law and order is chaos. And obedience, I mean, law and order is a good thing. And obedience to the Constitution, which after all is the supreme law, is the best of the good, right? So how can you resist the obligation in the Constitution? So my question is, you know, how do people get up enough gumption to resist it? What brings them to this state of things? Well, look, if you're teaching it, I would say maybe, you know, start with the Constitution. Ask your students, which is what contemporaries did ask themselves, right? Is this a slave document? Or is it just a recognition that slavery exists at the state level? And then the next question comes, how in the course of this period up through the Civil War did slavery become a central issue? Because, you know, starting out with, it really wasn't a central issue. You know, nobody gave a damn, as a matter of fact. They really didn't. There's a huge silence about it. You get the notion that slavery is on everybody's mind. I don't think it's on everybody's mind until certain things happen. Well, so you can teach it that way. I'll just end with some events that happened. Say you took the period, Andrew Jackson, like, let's start with 1828, next 5 years. Look at the stuff that's happening. So you got David Walker's appeal. Remember David Walker was this free black who wrote this pamphlet, sent it down south, said, hey, you guys want to get free down there? Just rise up and slit your master's throat. It's a good way to start. That's actually 1828. 1828, John C. Calhoun, you know, Exposition and Protest, written anonymously, where he sets forth his doctrine of nullification. Okay, that's 1828. Then Andrew Jackson gets elected in 1828, right? And then you've got William Lloyd Garrison, January 1st, 1831, first issue of the Liberator. And then you've got, what else you got? In Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831, you got Nat Turner's Rebellion. I mean, you could add a couple more. But for your students, just tell them to look at that. Is the die cast already? I think it is. Well, look, just one other thing. I got a couple minutes?
Yes. But no more. Okay.
Here's one case I teach that I can't figure out how to teach it. You tell me how to teach it. It's a case, it's an unreported case of Louisiana Supreme Court, Humphrey versus Utz, 1856. And it involves a slave. We don't know much about this slave. Usually we don't know much about any of the slaves, right? But we know he was a young man who was in trouble with the overseer, Utz. And so what did the overseer do? Well, he brutalized him nailed his privates to the bedstead, beat him over the head until he died, and then they buried him in an unmarked grave. And you know what happened then? Then the great wheels of Louisiana justice began to roll, right? And you think, my God, Utz, the overseer, is going to be punished because there were laws on the books in Louisiana against abusive treatment of slaves, right? Not. You know what happened? This was a civil case. Utz is suing the overseers for back wages. You know? And guess what? It goes before a jury, a white jury, and guess who's on the white jury? 12 overseers. So while Ginger Pop is rotting in an unmarked grave, we're arguing over who gets the back wages and who doesn't get the back wages. My question, I just leave it to you. Why are the laws on the books in Louisiana against this stuff are never applied? How do you teach this? I don't know. You tell me.
Thank you, Ken. Dita, would you like to proceed there?
Yes,
Okay.
Unless you want to sit down.
No, I'm fine. This is good for me.
Thank you all for coming today. I'm an American Indian historian rather than a Jacksonian scholar, and so I want to make a pitch today with thinking about the Jackson era from a little bit different perspective. And that's from the perspective of Cherokees, which I realize most of you think is very difficult because what sources do we use? You know, how do we engage our students with the historical documents of American Indians? And I would like to suggest to you that they are, in fact, out there. In fact, one of the most compelling documents I think I ever ran across was in the Newberry Library in Chicago, and it was a series of letters from children at a mission school just outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, supported by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, Mission Society headquartered in Boston and mostly supported by churches in Massachusetts. One of these children, a little girl by the name of Nancy Reese, wrote to a minister on Christmas Day of 1828, and she'd been taking a poll of her schoolmates out in the schoolyard about what they thought about the election of Andrew Jackson. And the children were understandably upset by this and by the what already people in the Cherokee Nation recognized would be an epic battle over their nation. One of the kids said, why don't they just go back where they came from? You know, that certainly would have solved the problem. But another one said, they have all this land that they aren't even using. Why do they want our land? And I think that that is central to understanding perhaps not only Indian removal, but much of the Jacksonian era. Why do they want what we've got when they have so much of their own? Why do they want our land? Why do they want our freedom? Why do they want to restrict us at the very time that their own society seems to be prospering? Indian societies, at least in the South, were prospering as well, and I think we should not lose sight of that. Their populations were increasing, just like the population of the United States was increasing. Not only that, but their economies were growing. Roads increasingly snaked across the Indian nations in the South. Not only federal roads, but also local toll roads. Indians supported transportation. Not only that, but a couple of decades of intense missionary work had resulted in an increasingly educated population. I think the literacy rate in the Cherokee Nation was about the same as that in the white South. Now that's literacy in their own language, not literacy in English, but 20% of Cherokees spoke and wrote English. So we're talking about a relatively well-educated population. All Southern Indians were moving toward centralizing their governments, creating republics. You know, these are important moves, and these are moves that ran into the face of a major ideological change about the difference in human beings. The Enlightenment view had been that human beings were fundamentally the same. What separated them was education and opportunity. And now Indians had access to education, they had access to opportunity, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, Indians were becoming, and I use this in quotes, civilized. At the same time, there was a new sort of attitude that was emerging, which focused on fundamental differences among people that were attributed to race rather than experience. So that the phrase, always an Indian, once an Indian, always an Indian, becomes a kind of hallmark of this thought about removing Indians. Indians have to be removed because they're never going to be absorbed into the broader society. And the problem with this was that there was considerable evidence to the contrary. There was considerable evidence to the contrary. Finally, there began to be a real crisis in American constitutional law, and in fact, international law. Because Indians had a whole series of treaties with the federal government, treaties that even dated back to the arrival of the first English colonists, and that Congress recognized as still being valid. Now, treaties are made between sovereigns. You know, I don't think any of you have probably made a treaty individually with Canada. And so treaties are between governments. And Indians had these treaties. This recognizes sovereignty. The Worcester case is another recognition of sovereignty, but it is on top of this long history of documents that recognize sovereignty. Jackson's answer to this, of course, was that we should simply stop making treaties with Indians and consider them invalid. He never convinced Congress of that, which raises a final point, and that is that Indian removal was incredibly hotly debated in the United States for the reasons I just mentioned. It was very difficult for many Americans to imagine dispossessing a people who seemed to be becoming a part of the American family. And the way to do this took all sorts of crooks and turns, and of course ultimately was successful in something that we bill as a great American tragedy. But it is a tragedy that was enormously complex, and that's what I urge you to help your students understand, that this is more than merely a moral issue, it's more than just a tragedy. It is an enormously complex issue, not just on the American side, but on the Native side as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we have a room filled with educators here. We have their attention. And so I'd like to just pose a few questions to all of you to suggest, is there a person, other than Jackson, from this era that you wish that we knew more about, or that you wish that students knew more about? Such a good question that nobody has anything to say. Ken?
I'm making a case for Ginger Pop. You know, the guy who was murdered, and we know nothing about him. I suppose the question I would ask is, well, why do we know nothing about him? Or the other several million slaves, when you stop to think how little we know about that population. I mean, it's a question worth posing because it raises other questions. So that's my suggestion.
Okay, we've got one nominee.
John Quincy Adams.
So say something about why Adams.
Adams, I think, is enormously admirable, and of course we know most about him in his post-president period in Congress, in which he became a champion of the slaves, essentially. But I think it's also, from my perspective as an Indian historian, important to point out that John Quincy Adams had the courage to refuse to enforce a treaty that had been made under fraud. And this is almost unheard of in American history. I mean, he not only was a champion of slaves, but he was also a champion for Indian sovereignty. I wouldn't say exactly Indian people, but he at least believed the law should be followed. And so I would like students to realize that in many respects, he's a more important figure in this period than Jackson.
Okay. Did you go? Carol?
I think,
You may have to press this button.
sorry.
There you go.
I think this is, as a high school history teacher, teaching essentially a survey course to freshmen. We are presented with several challenges in this arena. There are a lot of voices that deserve to be heard and investigated during this time period. And I would agree that some of the unknown voices need to be sort of researched and discovered. I will admit to having overlooked John Quincy Adams on several occasions because we've had to move on. But I also love this time period because you do have the opportunity to investigate so many voices of people like Horace Mann, Dorothea Dix, David Walker, Frederick Douglass, the Grimke sisters. There are all these tremendous voices that students are really able to identify with, and there are ways that you can open these doors and these windows into their lives and see a little bit of them that students can very much relate to. If you're going for identity with the social issues and creating social change in the world. The Heidlers referred to the triumvirate earlier in the Senate, and that's another opportunity to look at who is representing us. And do they reflect our core values and this issue of nationalism versus sectionalism? Where are their interests, where do their interests lie, and what are they saying when they say those words in Senate? So I think picking one would be a great challenge, and in this unit, one of the goals might be to look at as many as possible and provide as much access as possible.
Thank you. Laura, do you?
So I now have throughout the course of today, I've made a list for myself of people that I need to learn more about, including Clay and Calhoun, and Jackson, frankly. I agree that it's hard to think of, when we're doing survey courses, and just that I personally have not been as interested in like cults of personality or in individual figures. I agree that documents are really interesting. I really want to look at that survey of Cherokee children now. That seems very interesting. I'm interested in Thoreau, many of the reformers. I'm interested in the petition, so a textbook that I read said that that there was this first national women's petition drive to oppose the Indian Removal Acts, and so who started that and organized that would be something that I'm interested in, and how women's rights grew during this era, and like women's power and the realization of women's power grew during this era is something that I'm interested in knowing more, and who were the sort of catalysts of that.
Thank you. You mentioned documents. I wonder if each of you has a document in mind that you have taught to students that you thought was particularly helpful for students in giving them some new perspective from this era.
So we actually just did a quote analysis yesterday in my class. We're wrapping up the reform movement, and I give them quotes from various reformers and have them identify which reform movement it represents and provide me evidence with why it would represent it. There are so many wonderful documents during this time period, and I think, and I probably will misquote it, one of my most favorite quotes is from Frederick Douglass, where he appears before people and he says, "I appear here tonight as a thief and a robber, and I have stolen my head and these limbs and this body from my master and run off with them." And I think that if I had to really dive deep into just one document, that might be the core document I dive into, because it just carries so much weight in that one sentence. But I love Dorothea Dix as well, because prison reform is, and the care and concern for mental illness is a huge issue today. And her address to Massachusetts State Legislature is tremendously powerful, particularly to students of Massachusetts who can identify with the locations. So again, bringing that relevancy. Anytime you can wrap them into something they can relate to personally, they're going to buy in more. So yeah, those are mine.
Peter, did you have any thoughts?
I think I would choose the Cherokees Memorial and Protest of the Cherokee Nation, in which the Cherokees describe what is happening to their nation as removal proceeds. And in the process, it's not just a matter of seizing property and attacks and all of that, but it gives a really good picture of what Cherokee life was like. Because they complain about their schools being closed, their government not being able to meet, and so you get a picture of the nation as it was and a picture of the nation as it's become.
Okay, thank you. Laura?
So one that we had a lot of fun with is a political cartoon from New York from 1833 called John C. Calhoun Reaching for Despotism. And it's just a fun cartoon because it's really rich with a lot of detail. So it has, like, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it has the Constitution dead and E pluribus unum dead at the bottom. And then these steps up of nullification, the South Carolina Ordinance, treason, civil war, deception, disunion, anarchy, and then despotism or tyranny. So it was really helpful and just fun for students to sort of pick that apart. And it's fun when they get into history. So at the end, they're like, oh, that's deep though. It was just fun. And they're able to identify the characters in the figures in the cartoon and discuss. And actually last night at dinner, Dr. Heidler was pointing out that from Calhoun's perspective, nullification was not a step towards secession, but was an alternative to secession, and that's something that I hadn't really thought about, is that from a New York perspective, it might be a step towards secession and disunion, but from a Carolinian perspective, it might be separate. So that would be another interesting thing I'll get into next time I talk about it.
Okay, thanks. Ken?
A couple of things, but one especially, I think perhaps your students should read at least a major part of Chief Justice Taney's opinion in Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857 case, where he says that descendants of Africans in this country, whether they be slaves or free black people, have no rights under the Constitution of the United States. I mean, it's probably the single most racist statement that was ever issued by a Supreme Court of the United States Chief Justice or any justice. But the interesting thing about that, and you might connect it if you teach this kind of course, this was not, believe it or not, a radical idea, but it was a reflection of the state slave law, and every single slave state of the Union said exactly the same thing. That is to say that slaves have no rights under the law, which white people are bound to respect. I mean, it's a sad thing to say, but we were truly a racist nation. Just one other point, if you're teaching this, you could start with Taney's opinion, study a little maybe of Kenneth Stamp's book called Peculiar Institution, where he studies Southern state slave law. You might want to end up with Benjamin Robin Curtis, who becomes a Supreme Court justice, and he becomes a senator from Massachusetts after Daniel Webster is dethroned and dies. Curtis's defense of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is a chilling document, because what it says, I mean, by the way, Curtis becomes a hero among moderates because he dissents from Taney and Dred Scott. But you know something, he ain't a very pretty guy. In this speech, he said, look, we don't want any black people up here in Massachusetts because they just don't fit in. I mean, so here's the champion of black people saying what he really thinks. Put these things together, it's chilling.
So I'm going to ask one last question of our group, and then we're going to open it up for all of you. This is a period in which, in which law and the meaning of the Constitution looms very large, and it's loomed pretty large in all of your presentations. But it's also a period with lots of violence. There are, of course, wars with native peoples. There are attempted slave revolts, and there are urban riots. So what place does the violence of the era play in your teaching? And do you have the impression that American society was becoming more violent in this period of time?
I think that's an interesting question that plays on the same question of rule of law and what do you do if the government is not representing your interests. So in what circumstances, if any, is a violent reaction to a system that is perpetuating violence appropriate? So I think Nat Turner's Rebellion is a really interesting question, or it raises really interesting questions for my students who are largely African American, well, are largely Black. So is it okay to kill babies, like white babies? Is it okay to kill white women? Is it okay to kill literally every white person you see? And why would someone do that? And they have really interesting discussions about it. And then what are the effects of that violence on laws, on reactions to abolitionists, on reactions to John Brown in the North and the South, and in causing other riots, like the snow riots in DC. I think the question of violence is really interesting. I don't think that, it doesn't strike me as more violent as any other period. It's difficult to get more violent than tarring and feathering people, I think, which is incredibly violent. And slavery has been existing in an incredibly violent form that predates this. Although I think racism increases and like the violence of white supremacy increases.
Other thoughts, Ken?
Well, after that marvelous discussion of Andrew Jackson by Professors Heidler's, violence, hey, look at Jackson was an extremely violent man, and in a sense, I guess you might say he was representative. The one thing always amazes me about that is what does it say about the American people that they like Jackson so much? I think they didn't mind a little violence. You know who are the least violent people and who were the most justified in being violent? The slaves. We think of Nat Turner's Rebellion, but when you look at the small number of actual rebellions, here's a population of millions of people who deserve to be violent, and yet they aren't.
Thanks.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact because we teach slave rebellions and sort of the motivation for them and the outcome of them. But I'd like to address the concern as a teacher that history is often represented from the folks who won and the folks who have power. So my concern in teaching these events is ensuring that we're looking at it from the side or from the documents that show us the perspective of the people who maybe initiated the violence. And so knowing more about how people organized or how people came together would be an essential part of understanding the violence that occurred. I would agree wholeheartedly with Laura that the institution of slavery was an incredibly violent institution, and in response to that, there was more violence. As a reaction to that, there was more violence. And I think put in that term, in that way, we're able to see the perspectives and hear the voices of different people. And one of the things we were discussing last night, and I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have had these discussions with historians with extreme extremely rich knowledge base, is this idea that our history textbooks really present a viewpoint of these events. And there's a gentleman at UMass Boston who's doing some research into the language of textbooks, and it's fairly provocative in the way that textbooks present these events as sort of inevitable. The violence was an inevitable and justified need for the end result of expansionism or remaining unified. And as teachers, I think it's really important for us to not only think critically about how we're presenting these instances of violence from the perspectives of all parties, but also to think critically how it's being communicated to our students in the textbooks and in the readings we give them.
Thank you. Teacher, do you have some?
I think one of the really interesting things about this period where Indians are concerned is that the violence involved in this was mostly on the side of the United States, not the Indian tribes. The Creeks were great victims of violence where whites began to move into their land before they left. They were guaranteed the right to stay if they wanted to receive private ownership. And this was totally ignored, and they ended up being moved as a military measure because of white invasion. Black Hawk's War, which is really, I guess, the only incident that gets the name war. Black Hawk's War was simply because the Saukees wanted to come back across the Mississippi River to try to salvage what they could of their crops because they were starving to death in Iowa, and the Illinois militia attacked them. So I think that one of the things that looking at violence does is it counters our stereotypes of Indian people. It counters stereotypes of slaves, I think. And I think that you're right. It's probably well worth looking at.
Okay, thank you. I think we should open it up, but is it very brief? Okay, very brief.
Okay, I think it is incredibly important when you're talking about oppression, especially if you're looking at underrepresented or oppressed groups, and that's who you're teaching, to include resistance to oppression. So for my students, it is incredibly important not to just read like slavery happened and it was terrible, but how slaves resisted every day, because otherwise you get movies like Django that perpetuate this idea that Django is, what they said in the movie, 1 in a million niggers, and that nobody was resisting, and that this wasn't happening. So for my students, it was incredibly transformative to see how Native Americans and enslaved Africans resisted.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the floor is open. We've got a question here in the center aisle.
Hi, I don't want to say I'm amused, but I'm somewhat surprised that Jackson did get elected because he was a violent man. My question is pretty simple. Were the voters aware of his violence, or were his war heroics just glamorized such in the press, whatever it was of the press at that time?
Well, it's certainly my impression that the opposition to Jackson highlighted just what a violent man he was in hopes of discrediting Jackson in the eyes of voters. But as Kent pointed out, a great number of voters thought that violence might in fact qualify him for office.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to add something to that in terms of teaching high school. As a high school history teacher, it might be surprising to know that I do not have a tremendous amount of time to be doing research and sort of, investigating topics. So even sitting here today, listening, I learned a great deal about a time period that I teach. And one of the things I was not quite as aware of as I might have or should have been was this idea that Jackson used newspapers to build his image and create his image. And yet from, Professor Howe, Dr. Howe, I knew that newspapers were becoming prevalent during this time period. And I think the challenge for high school educators is to understand the context in which the documents we're looking at were written. So for me, it would be very easy to look at a document about Jackson that comes from a newspaper, which is a primary source of the time, and use that to teach Jackson, inadvertently teaching Jackson from the perspective of the biased newspaper. And I think that happens today as well. So I think that's part of the concern when we're looking at how could a man like that get elected. Well, it depends on what you're reading and what you're exposed to, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I know this is slightly past the period, but wasn't there some violence after 1860?
Thank you. I'm not a teacher, but I wanted to thank you all for helping me understand many of these things. And I offer 2 books that have helped me think about these issues, and they pick up on some of the things you've mentioned. For example, the fading of the Enlightenment and the idea that all people are created equal. I read a book called America's Longest Siege. It's written by someone named Kelly, who teaches English at the College of Charleston. And it goes up to the 1840s, I guess. The point is that there was a change from the founding fathers who believed that slavery would die out, and through Calhoun, who came to champion the idea that African Americans, and I suppose Native Americans as well, were inherently inferior, would never be able to be would never achieve the level of civilization that the people in control would. And the whole question about violence, I've really appreciated a book by David Hackett Fisher, Albion Seed, where he traces 4 migrations from the British Isles to North America. And what I think of when I think about Jackson is the point that he comes from the 4th migration, I believe, which is the people from the northern borderlands of Britain, lowland Scots, and Northern Ireland. And these are the places where there was never really a central government, that there were basically clans and gangs. And they moved to the interior part of the South. His point is that they were always the most violent, the poorest, and the most ignorant people of the 4 migrations. Now, this is, again, engaging in a kind of generalization that you want to avoid, but the detail of the cultures that he describes really have helped me understand American politics even today. And the maps that he includes show electoral results, up into the 20th century to show the influence of these cultures. So.
Thank you. Do you want, go ahead.
Could I just take advantage of the microphone here a bit? I just wanted to say that resistance to injustice doesn't have to be violent. And if you look at the way in which slaves resisted slavery, short of overt violence and murder and so on, there's a famous book by Helen Catterall, who 5-volume book of cases related to human slavery. If you look at the index of that book, what you will discover is the way ordinary people resisted slavery, by being lazy, by arson occasionally. That's violent, but not that violent. Putting toads in the soup. There are all sorts of ways. So just because there weren't overt slave rebellions doesn't mean there wasn't resistance. One other point that strikes me about teaching, it must be very difficult for you, and it certainly has been for me. It's very tempting to teach school from the standpoint of violent episodes, because in a sense that's dramatic stuff. It's what people pay attention to. You get your kids to sit up straight when you talk about murder and mayhem and so on. But I think Professor Howe's marvelous speech reminds us that there's other stuff going on in American history other than slavery, other than violence, and of course, ultimately, other than civil war. So somehow how you put all of this together, looking at my fellow teachers here on the panel today, I'm just impressed that it'll be done beautifully, but it's a difficult job.
May I have a final word on resistance? I think you're absolutely right, and we have to remember that one of the most lasting acts of resistance in the Jacksonian era was the case Worcester versus Georgia, which established the sovereignty of American Indian tribes, a limited sovereignty, but sovereignty nonetheless. And it is a case that was resurrected at the end of the 20th century that enabled Indian tribes to take control of their own affairs. It is at the heart of the gaming casinos, and I don't know how you feel about gaming, but what they have done for a number of tribes is give them the means by which to manage their own affairs. And, you know, I see that as kind of the legacy of the removal era. They may have lost the land in the Southeast and elsewhere, but there is a really positive thing that comes out of that.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know, what did the rest of the world think of the American experiment? At this time, with all the violence, all the warts, what did Europe, what did Asia think of the U.S.?
Well, I think they're divided. I think there are a great number of people. I mean, we know best about Britain. A great number of people who saw it as a great hope because it offers democracy. So there are many great champions, but there are also powerful critics who would point to what they saw as the violence of American life. They would point to what they saw as the crudity of American life and culture. And they would especially highlight the dispossession of Indians and slavery as being things that disqualified Americans from speaking on a high moral ground to the rest of the world. So there's a real division in how Europeans view the United States.
I think to that end, there's a really nice, I think from Puck, British cartoon that has a Southern American sort of relaxing with his feet up on the head of Washington, and I think his bubble says, maybe it says American freedom or something, but then in the background there's lynch laws, there's a slave auction block, there's the war with Mexico, sort of highlighting, there's a duel, I think, in the back, just sort of highlighting all the American transgressions. And then you have de Tocqueville as well, who's coming around saying America is this great hope.
Okay, any last thoughts for?
And de Tocqueville referred to removal as destroying American Indians or destroying people with great humanity. I mean, it was, the implication is that, here the whole guise for removal is doing the right thing by the Indians, and in fact it's destroying them. And he was appalled.
Okay.
A little on off topic, but as I sit here and I'm furiously taking notes on all the books I now need to read and the articles I have to examine, I just would like to emphasize for teachers in the room how important relationships are with your local organizations and even national organizations like NERC that will support us in our teaching and provide us examples of units and give us primary source documents. There are some really wonderful organizations out there and partnerships that should be used and appreciated, because we cannot do all of this messiness on our own, and it would benefit us all to really look towards our partners and seek help and have conversations with the folks that investigate and spend time and energy and great deals of love to research this information to allow us to have access to it.
Well, please join me in thanking my fellow panelists.